In 1943, a 6'2" American woman walks into a secret government office in Washington, D.C. She's 31 years old, desperate to serve her country during World War II, and she's just been rejected by the military. The reason? She's too tall. So she does what any brilliant, stubborn woman would do. She finds a way in through the back door. She joins the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, and spends the next 4 years developing shark repellent for underwater explosives, managing classified documents in Ceylon and China, and learning that rules are made to be broken if you're smart enough and bold enough to know which ones don't matter. Her name is Julia McWilliams. You know her as Julia Child. And before she became the woman who taught America how to cook, before she revolutionized television, before she became a cultural icon, she was a spy, a lover, a woman who reinvented herself completely at an age when most people think their lives are already decided. This is the story of how an awkward, directionless California girl became one of the most empowering figures of the 20th century, not by following the rules, but by having the courage to write her own. Julia McWilliams was born in 1912 in Pasadena, California, into comfortable upper-middle-class privilege, and she was absolutely, spectacularly ordinary. She was tall, freakishly tall for a woman, hitting 6 feet by high school. She was loud, clumsy, the kind of girl who didn't fit the narrow definition of what young women were supposed to be. Delicate, refined, quietly ambitious for marriage and children. She went to Smith College, graduated in 1934 with a history degree, and absolutely no idea what to do with her life. She tried advertising in New York. Boring. She tried writing. Nothing stuck. By her late 20s, Julia was back in Pasadena, unmarried, unemployed, drifting. Her friends were getting married, having children, settling into prescribed lives. And Julia was just waiting. Here's what's empowering about this. She didn't have it figured out. At 30, she was lost, and that's okay. Because what Julia had, what would prove more important than early success, was a willingness to say yes to things that scared her, to take risks that didn't make sense, to keep trying even when she had no idea where she was going. When World War II broke out, Julia saw an opportunity for escape. Escape from Pasadena, from expectations, from the suffocating feeling that her life was going to be small and predictable. She tried to join the Women's Army Corps, rejected, too tall. The Navy's Waves program, rejected, too tall. But Julia was stubborn. She found her way into the OSS, America's wartime spy agency, working in the registry, tracking secret documents, managing intelligence reports. It sounds boring, but it wasn't. The registry was the nervous system of the entire operation. Julia knew everything. In Ceylon, she met Paul Child. He was a sophisticated OSS officer who spoke French, painted watercolors, loved food and wine and art. Paul was 10 years older, shorter than Julia by several inches, worldly in ways that made her feel provincial. He should have been out of her league, but Paul saw something in Julia that she didn't yet see in herself: potential. A huge, generous spirit that hadn't yet found its purpose. They became friends first. Paul introduced Julia to good food. Not bland American cooking, but spicy curries, fresh fish, complex flavors that actually tasted like something. He treated her like someone whose opinions mattered. And Julia, who had spent 30 years feeling like she was too much, too tall, too loud, too awkward, started to realize that maybe she wasn't too much. Maybe she was exactly enough. When the war ended, Julia and Paul married in 1946. She was 34, by her era's standards, practically a spinster. But Julia didn't marry Paul because she was desperate. She married him because he was her intellectual equal, her adventure partner, the person who made her feel like the world was bigger and more interesting than she'd imagined. Their marriage wasn't conventional. Paul supported Julia's ambitions before she even had any. Paul's foreign service job took them to Paris in 1948, and this is where Julia's life truly began. She was 36 years old. In Paris, she ate her first real French meal, sole meunière, oysters, wine, and something inside her woke up. She'd been eating food her entire life, but she'd never really tasted it. French food was art, pleasure, proof that eating could be one of the great experiences of being human. Julia decided at 36, with no cooking experience, that she was going to learn French cooking, seriously, professionally. She enrolled in Le Cordon Bleu, the most prestigious cooking school in the world. She was the only woman in her class. The instructors treated her like a curiosity at best. But Julia didn't care. She was 6'2", she'd been rejected by the military, she'd worked for the OSS, and she was done caring what people thought she should do. She threw herself into cooking with intensity, except now she'd found the thing that actually mattered to her. She practiced constantly, made terrible mistakes, burned things, and served Paul barely edible dishes while she figured it out. But she persisted, because for the first time in her life, Julia had found something she loved enough to be bad at. Julia understood something no one else in America seemed to get. Cooking wasn't about status or sophistication. It was about pleasure, about feeding people you loved. And American women in the 1950s, trapped in suburban kitchens, making casseroles and Jell-O salads, deserved better. Julia met two American women in Paris, Simone Beck and Louisette Bertholle, who were working on a French cookbook for Americans. The three spent the next decade writing, testing, perfecting what would become Mastering the Art of French Cooking. This wasn't fancy restaurant recipes. It was a book that taught Americans, step by step, exactly how to make real French food in their own kitchens. The book was rejected by multiple publishers. Too long, too detailed. Americans didn't want to spend hours making dinner. But Julia kept pushing, believing American women were smarter and more capable than the culture gave them credit for. In 1961, when Julia was 49, Mastering the Art of French Cooking was finally published. A massive 700-page tome that treated home cooks like intelligent adults. The book sold steadily, but what made Julia an icon was television. In 1962, she appeared on a Boston public television show to promote her cookbook. She made an omelet on live TV. Julia wasn't polished. She wasn't performing femininity the way women on television were expected to. She was herself, tall, goofy, completely unself-conscious. She dropped things, made jokes, had fun. Viewers were transfixed. The station was flooded with calls. The French Chef premiered in 1963, and it changed television forever. This was before cooking shows were a genre, before the Food Network. Julia was just a middle-aged woman in a simple kitchen, teaching people how to cook with so much joy and authenticity that millions of Americans fell in love with her. Here's what made Julia Child truly empowering. She gave people permission to be imperfect. Her most famous moment was when she flipped a potato pancake and it landed on the stove instead of in the pan. She just picked it up, plopped it back, and said, "Remember, you're alone in the kitchen and no one can see you." That complete lack of pretension was revolutionary. Women in the 1950s and 60s were told they had to be perfect. Perfect wives, perfect mothers, perfect hostesses. Julia was the opposite. She was 6'2" and ungainly. Her voice was weird. She made mistakes on camera and didn't apologize. She drank wine while cooking. She made cooking look hard and messy and totally worth it. She made it okay to be ambitious and ridiculous at the same time. And she did this while never having children. Julia and Paul tried and couldn't. In an era when a woman's worth was measured by motherhood, Julia built a wildly successful career and deeply loving marriage without kids. She never apologized for it. She and Paul had a partnership based on mutual respect, shared interests, genuine affection. They were happy. Julia's example showed millions of women there were other ways to build a meaningful life. Julia was also secretly subversive. She drank openly on camera with obvious pleasure. She talked about butter and cream at a time when American culture was becoming obsessed with dieting. She celebrated food as pleasure, not fuel. She was large, taking up space, and never apologized for her body or tried to make herself smaller. She existed loudly and joyfully in a culture that told women to be quiet and dainty. But here's what matters most. She proved it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. She was 36 when she learned to cook, 49 when her first book was published, 51 when she became a television star. In a youth-obsessed culture, Julia's greatest achievements all came in middle age and beyond. She proved you don't have to have it all figured out in your 20s. That finding your passion late is better than never finding it at all. That reinvention is always possible if you're brave enough to look foolish while you're learning. She also proved women don't have to choose between being smart and being joyful, between being ambitious and being kind, between being successful and being authentic. Julia was all of those things at once. She was a brilliant teacher, a savvy businesswoman, a devoted wife, a public figure who never lost her essential weirdness and humanity. There's something profound about Julia Child's brand of feminism that gets overlooked in discussions of women's liberation. She wasn't marching with signs or burning bras or writing manifestos, though she lived through all of that and supported it in her quiet way. Julia's feminism was more subversive because it was so joyful, so unapologetic, so rooted in the simple act of taking up space and refusing to apologize for it. She showed women that power doesn't always look like anger or righteousness. Sometimes it looks like a 6'2" woman laughing at her own mistakes on national television while drinking wine and teaching millions of people that perfection is overrated. Think about what Julia was really doing when she appeared on television in 1963. She was 51 years old in a culture obsessed with youth and beauty. She had a strange, warbling voice that people loved to mock. She was physically awkward, knocking things over, spilling ingredients, making messes. She never wore particularly fashionable clothes or styled her hair in the latest trends. She just showed up as herself, completely and utterly, and dared the world to love her anyway. And the world did. Not despite her weirdness, but because of it. Because she gave permission for everyone watching to be weird too, to be imperfect, to be authentically themselves in a culture that demanded women be decorative and diminished. Julia's real revolutionary act was showing that women could be authorities without being apologetic about it. When she taught cooking, she didn't defer to male chefs or pretend that her knowledge was somehow lesser, because she was self-taught and came to it late. She knew her stuff. She'd tested every recipe dozens of times. She understood technique and chemistry and history, and she presented that knowledge with absolute confidence, never second-guessing herself, never asking permission to be an expert. In an era when women were still fighting to be taken seriously in professional spaces, Julia simply assumed she deserved to be taken seriously, and that assumption changed everything. What's particularly powerful about Julia's example is that she proved you could be deeply traditionally feminine, in some ways loving cooking, devoted to her marriage, domestic in her interests, while also being ambitious, authoritative, and unapologetically large in personality and presence. She didn't have to reject femininity to claim power. She didn't have to become hard or masculine or aggressive. She could love butter and wine and feeding people while also building an empire, making millions, becoming a household name. She showed that there's no one way to be a powerful woman, that you don't have to choose between being nurturing and being ambitious, between caring about domestic arts and being taken seriously as a professional. And perhaps most importantly, Julia showed that women's work in the domestic sphere deserves respect and attention and can be just as important as any work done in traditionally male-dominated fields. Cooking had been dismissed as women's work, as trivial, as something any housewife should be able to do without thinking about it. Julia elevated it. She treated it as craft, as art, as worthy of serious study and practice. She demanded that people pay attention to technique and ingredients and process. She made cooking visible as skilled labor rather than invisible as natural female duty. In doing so, she helped shift the cultural conversation about what counts as important work and who gets to decide. Julia died in 2004, 2 days before her 92nd birthday. She lived through the Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the rise of the internet, long enough to see the feminist movement evolve through multiple waves, long enough to see women enter spaces that had been closed to them, long enough to see the conversation about women's roles transform completely. And through it all, she remained a feminist icon, not because she was perfect, or because she said all the right things, or because she fit neatly into anyone's political agenda, but because she lived her life with such tremendous authenticity and joy. The real secret of Julia Child's power wasn't her recipes, or her television presence, or even her personality. It was this: Julia gave people permission to be themselves, to be ambitious and silly, to try hard and fail publicly, to take pleasure seriously, to not apologize for taking up space or having a weird voice or being too tall or too old or too anything. She proved that the things that make you strange are often the things that make you powerful, that there's no one right way to be a woman or an artist or a success, that you can reinvent yourself at any age if you're willing to be bad at something long enough to get good at it. That joy is a form of rebellion. Julia Child was a spy who became a chef, a directionless rich girl who became a revolutionary, an awkward, too tall woman who became an icon by never trying to be anything other than herself. She lived her life with appetite, for food, for experience, for connection, for pleasure. And in doing so, she taught millions of people that the best way to live is to show up fully, mess up regularly, and never stop being hungry for more. Bon appétit, indeed.